You've got your full warehouse, you've got labor impacts of that, the unique labor market is this at this time. But you also got the finance side. You have a cash flow problem all of a sudden. And now you've got a liquidation issue. I need to liquidate and take a huge hit on my margin so I can open up my open to buy so I can get new product. There's so many facets that feed into this. I don't think we thought about all the connective tissue the same way like we do today.
I believe reliability has now become the most important. And what I mean by that, not only a reliable supply chain, but at the end of the day, if my employee calls in sick or isn't reliable or doesn't show up for work or whatever it is, I don't have either that salesperson or that product to do what my business needs to do. And I think it's even more critical than it ever was in the past that we get people and have systems that show up. We need people to step up and fill the actual execution of our plans.
I think we're at that stage now where we have this environment where we're all kind of moving very quickly, but we're not kind of pausing to regroup ourselves and to reassess, okay, if we're looking to try and have agility and consistency and reliability, maybe the team as we've structured it doesn't work for that. Maybe the way we worked out our projects doesn't quite meet that need. So there's a gap in our professional development or a skill set to be able to take us into these digital implementations, to understand why we're taking them on and how best to use them, that they, keep turning up on time and every day.
Thank you for joining me today. My name is Gary Newbury. I'm an award-winning strategic advisor and delivery executive. I'm focused on the rapid transformation of disrupted supply chain performance across the make, move, sell flow of consumer products and services from production to porch and assembly floor to shelf. My purpose is to inspire business leaders, particularly those within the consumer products and retailing space, to think big, be bold, scale, adapt, and win, one epic supply chain transformation at a time. There's additional content available from my website, RetailAID.ca, or on my YouTube channel, RetailAID. Be sure to check these out. As the business world faces significant volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity, business leaders looking to drive market-leading performance need to be tapping into thought leaders, strategic advisors, and implementation executives who have mastery of operational turnarounds and strategic transformations, together with a strong track record of transitioning enterprises to become more agile, innovative, and digital. There's great material to get through here, so let's get started. Welcome everybody to RetailAID podcast series, Retailing Conversation of the 2020s. I've got a great crew today. I've got Jeff Starnaman, Audrey Ross, and Luke O'Hare. So I'm just going to ask Jeff to kick us off with just a quick one-liner about what does he do for London Drugs.
Hi, Gary. Thank you. I work as the Vice President of Supply Chain here at London Drugs, which basically encompasses everything from getting product from the manufacturer all the way through to the transportation and logistics, and then into the stores, and then, of course, even the final mile of e-commerce delivery. So kind of the end-to-end of what it takes to get the products to the consumers. Looking forward to talking about the challenges that we all face.
Audrey?
Thanks for having me, Gary. It's lovely to see you and Luke, who I know, and to meet Jeff. So I'm a self-described trade geek, and I spend my days at Orchard Custom Beauty as the in-house person to make international trade happen, which involves, a lot of the sort of supply chain or traditional supply chain movements, but also there's a lot of pieces around export Incoterms and tax, as it turns out. So I keep myself busy in this environment, and definitely looking forward to talking about what's on for 2023.
Excellent. Thanks, Audrey. Luke?
Thanks, Gary. Luke O'Hare. I'm the Director of Logistics and Supply Chain Distribution for Urban Barn. So Urban Barn is a home furnishings and home furniture retailer here in Canada. So my team, Jeff kind of noted it well. My team leads from inbound logistics from overseas, so importing, all the way through to final mile for the customer. And we at Urban always think we're a little bit unique because we're big and bulky, so that adds that little level of complexity, right? And it's not just parcels. There's big stuff getting delivered to customers' home, and how do you manage all of that? The things I'm looking forward to in this conversation is, what does the supply chain look like moving forward from this black swan event that's just taken place, and all the changes that we want to do, that we're like, can we do them, and how do we do them? So that's what I'm really interested and looking forward to in today's conversation.
Thanks, Luke. Today, I'm going to be talking at long last about the supply chain and about some of the issues that we, certainly as retailers, need to be thinking about as we approach this area. The supply chain's been under considerable pressure over the last 3 years, and probably, I'd argue, for a long time before that. As the pandemic broke, many retailers suspended their plans of continuing to transform their operations and their supply chains as they handled the impacts of restrictions to go with multiple ways of asynchronous, accumulating and accelerating levels of disruption. As the economy started to reopen, there was often a continued imbalance between demand and supply as consumers adjusted their expectations and their paths to purchase. Recent sales patterns did not necessarily provide a great guide for demand planning, leaving some retailers with varying degrees of stock outs and overstocks. As we move forward from Q1 this year, 2023, I'd like to explore key supply chain challenges facing many retailers and within the current operating environment to highlight some of the opportunities to gain ground and win. Audrey, would you be able to kick us off with perhaps, we've had a pretty good description from the introductions of the elements of the supply chain, but if we were to just stand back and take off all the the company names and whatever, and think about what is a supply chain. If a customer went into the grocery store and the loaf of bread wasn't there on the shelf, and they say, oh, it's a supply chain, and you would have to explain, what are they trying to communicate to you? Would you be able to just give us a quick summary of what the supply chain seems to be?
Absolutely. And I think there may be some different iterations floating around, but typically we're talking about the handling of an entire production flow of goods and services. It starts with the absolute raw primary first components, and you're sourcing those from manufacturing. You're working on finding the right pieces and parts, which can be local, it can be international where you're finding these, and then you're building essentially links in this chain to connect the raw materials to a manufacturing partner, or if you're a manufacturer yourself, to create a finished good or even a service. And then it moves through to the piece around logistics, which is sort of more of one of the fun parts, and getting those finished goods into, in my case, we deal with a lot of business to business, so we're going into retailers like Jeff at London Drugs, or like an Urban Barn. And then or it could be direct to consumer, where you're dealing with it right until the point of somebody's porch or front door. So it really encompasses that whole array of activities, from the smallest part to the very last moment in that cycle.
So really, it's a bit of a miracle if it happens.
Exactly. There's a few things that can go wrong along the way.
So coming back to the initial departure point, as we look forward, given that we have been through, some people might describe it to hell and back over the last 3 years, and it's timely that we have this conversation almost on the anniversary of the start of the lockdowns. Some of the questions I have in my mind: what have we learned? Have we still got loads more to learn? And I think that's quite a valid question. And where are the opportunities going forward?
Gary, if I could jump in for a moment. When I was listening to Audrey there, almost everything she said resonated with me, but a few things really stood out. And I haven't used this as a definition before, but as I see it, certainly in my role, my job's about managing the friction points more than all the pieces of it, right? I don't run the manufacturing plant, and I'm not the buyer, I'm not the designer. I don't drive the 18-wheeler or manage the intermodal transportation, nor have I ever steamed across the Pacific in a ship liner, but not that I wouldn't enjoy it. If they'd take me for the 23-day trip, I think it'd be fun. All that said, my job is to pull out the friction. And what I think I've learned so many things. Career choices might have been one of them, but what I've learned is the different places where friction will get you. And there may be some new friction points that we didn't see before that I think we need to be a little more prepared for. And I think we've even learned things in the trans-Pacific shipping, which historically has been very consistent, right? That it was just there and you got yourself on the next ship and X number of days later it hits the port. And then having to learn that that's not necessarily the case, and what things do you need to be monitoring to see the problem coming and be able to understand. And like I think of it like a giant tidal wave. When you see the waters pulling out, that's when you need to start reacting. Don't wait for the wave to start coming towards you. That's a big change in my job now, is that not only do I know I have to jump in when the friction occurs, I need to make sure I monitor better when the friction's about to happen.
Such an interesting point, Jeff. I completely agree. I think never did I think I would be so interested in weather patterns. Based in the West Coast in Vancouver, boy, did we learn that when the lower mainland became an island, right? So I'm thinking, okay, great. Big snow melt, all of a sudden unseasonal weather. What's going to happen to the roads? Do I have capacity with somebody that I maybe have over-the-road shipping with, but can they go through the US to go around that? Things I never thought I'd think about, but these conversations, they said there's these moments of friction. I think it was Colin Powell said it. It's like looking around corners. And I think that was something that I really took from the last few years, is how do you look around corners? Like you said, don't wait for the tidal wave to hit you. And at that point, it's far too late. How do you kind of think about that in advance? So yeah, that totally resonates with me.
It is those anticipatory points as well. I think in the Canadian market last year, I started to notice that I'm in Toronto. I started to notice that the time from when the goods arrived at a rail terminal to the time I was getting them had increased. And it was noticeable enough that, I'm sort of talking with my colleagues, like, I thought this would be here. Isn't this here? Hasn't this delivered? And it's like, oh, no, it hasn't. And you're like, it's not a holiday weekend, though. Like, normally they're like, oh, okay. And you sort of treat it as this, like, oh, it's kind of a discrepancy. And then when you go into the next week, you're like, no, like there used to be, sort of a 2-day turnaround. And now it feels like a 4-day turnaround. And now it's a 5. You're like, something's happening. But you also didn't necessarily leap to the worst case conclusion, which was everything in Vancouver has backed up. The rail line is having these complete difficulties. And there wasn't a lot of advertisement either, or communication from some of the different stakeholders. So the rail lines weren't talking about how many issues they were having, or the labor shortage issue, or the warehouse issue, or the fact that there was kind of a high volume issue. And so I felt like I was sort of, left to be a detective myself and figure it out. And I think moving into 2023, it's starting to see, like you say, Jeff, seeing that the wave pulling out, and then going towards, a little bit less optimistic in my approach, and kind of going to that worst case scenario and being like, oh, okay, what if this is all backed up? And how do I, like you said, Luke, how do I find the partner who has the rerouting or the other options? And how do I maintain those relationships? Because I might not need them at the moment, but how do I have them available when I do need them? And I'm able to pivot.
Yeah, I think you said something really interesting, Audrey. There's, we talk about supply chain or supply network, right? And it is, pieces that fit together. But we've had to really break it down and think about the effectiveness of each of the little components of that supply chain, right? It's like, okay, great. Jeff mentioned earlier the Trans-Pacific. Shipping was, okay, it takes 60 days instead of 35 days. No, it doesn't. It takes 3 more weeks to get a container, 60 more days to ship, 4 more days to get it from the DC. And, it's not actually 60 days, it's 90 days. And I think the really interesting, that's a nice word to use, conversations that came out of that was all those little components that add up to quote unquote lateness have an impact on the front end of the business, right? It might be a product launch, which you have a partnership with maybe a retailer that has an expectation of that. Or if I think about my business, furniture, you can pre-sell. So the customer goes, okay, they've got an ETA, they've given us our hard-earned money, from that consumer standpoint, and now we're delivering them going, hey, we're another 30 days delayed. And that drives a whole nother set of conversations. So you got this really interesting like B2B customer experience, but you also got this B2C customer experience. Both were impacted like dramatically. And did you have the trust in the relationship to continue to deliver them, this really ongoing bad news for like quite an extended period of time?
If I could build off that, and both Audrey and Luke have said things that kind of tie into where I'm going to go. When things first went sideways, hard to believe, call it 2.5 years ago now, supply chain professionals got into this conversation around just in time versus just in case inventory levels, right? And someone seemed to believe that that was the silver bullet of a solution. And well, certainly London Drugs, I don't want to speak for anyone else, but you can certainly turn to any business broadcast and see what I'm about to share with you. But we've spent the last year digging ourselves out of a whole bunch of inventory because we bought into the hype of just in case was the new solution. And what supply chain more so is about, it's not about inventory, it's about time. It's about how do you control time. Luke talked about controlling time with the customer and the pre-order and the taking of the money and the building in expectations. But then there's also understanding all the other time components. Did my trans-Pacific shipping just change 35 to 60 days? Or is, like I think of intermodal and rail across the country. 2 years ago, I'd never heard about slow running trains because it was minus 30 degrees in Winnipeg. Yet I've now learned it happened 37 times the year before last, but we didn't talk about it because it wasn't a thing and we weren't watching time like we all watch time today. And so it's not about inventory, it's about time and understanding how to control time so that the right inventory is in the right place at the right time and it's not building up.
Jeff, it's so powerful because the other thing I think about is where you talked about all these inventories building, which, like you said, it's in the news. All of a sudden, that has a huge financial impact on the business, right? You've got additional costs in warehousing. You've got obviously your full warehouse. You got labor impacts of that. And we know, what a unique labor market is at this time. But you also got the finance side. You have a cash flow problem all of a sudden, right? And now you've got a liquidation issue. I need to all of a sudden liquidate, and all of a sudden I'm going to take a huge hit on my margin so I can open up my open to buy so I can get new product. So it's really like there's so many facets that feed into this that I don't think we thought about all the connective tissue the same way like we do today. We've got a long way to do to be able to enhance it or improve at it, but at least now we're having the conversations around, again, all the connective tissue that kind of just worked before. Now we're like, hey, the ligaments need work. How do we build the strength of those ligaments?
It's a great point, Luke. The previous podcast, which released recently, was about that change in finance model, which underpins retail, and which has fundamentally changed over the last 30 or 40 years, almost imperceptibly, but it's there. In bygone days, we used to source locally. We used to buy a couple of pallets worth, get them into our network, send them out, convert it to cash, and pay the supplier 60, 90 days later. Job done. If we grew our business, we grew our cash flow. It was an anomaly compared to most other businesses. But today, we've got to a point where we order, we have to pay in advance often through letters of credits and other documentary things, which Audrey is all over. And then if there's a delay, we already have in our kind of margin projections covering the cost of that in terms of the interest and financing of that. But if there's a delay, there's a big issue now, because that comes in container loads, assuming it does come across at somewhere close to the scheduled time. Then we have to tip it out into a warehouse, and we may already have a fairly full warehouse because of previous shipments into the warehouse. We can't seem to shove them through the network quickly enough. So the delay of us getting that cash, and of course in furniture it might be slightly different. You've got a slightly different dynamic to, say, London Drugs, where you have to get it into the hands of a customer before they, give you a cash or cash equivalent. That whole thing could have expanded by 60, 90, 100 days quite easily. And on top of that, if you're a non-essential retailer during the period of restrictions, you were in a serious situation, because the only thing you could sell was through e-commerce. So your opportunity to sell volumes that you're used to was very restricted, because everything had to be individually picked, put in a box, labels, and then put into the hands of either your own carrier or UPS or whoever to get to the customer. You raise a really interesting point about cash flow. And alongside that, we developed capabilities. We had to do it on the hoof often to actually find alternative routes. But what I've been proposing over the last couple of years has been to develop those capabilities and experiment with them and rehearse them frequently. So in the movement between, say, China and here, the often used way of getting it across quickly, and it's often under the pressure of, we're running late, put it on the plane. Oh, then it was a mad scramble. How do we do that? What paperwork do we need? Who do we need to talk to? Which carrier do we need to use? And what's the configuration of the storage? How do we fit into a ULD? We have to, the capabilities that we worked through during the pandemic, we have to continue to experiment with those. And once we've got to a good place, actually rehearse those frequently. So when we have to react to something like a border closure or some other event like a Suez Canal, we know how to do these things, and we can just get on and do it. And it doesn't affect so badly our ability to service our customers.
It's become a part of our job is sort of to understand what products we have, what our customers' needs are, what our internal customer service needs are. A big part of my job has become, obviously, the weather tracking. You're sort of a meteorologist, but you have to keep on top of this news and on top of a lot more relationships. I mean, I don't think we're in an age anymore, when the pandemic was sort of at its worst in 2020, 2021, and prices were going up. It wasn't exclusively the pricing that was the problem, the capacity was the problem. So I was working with a core group of forwarders and transportation partners who couldn't get capacity all of a sudden, and I still was under the pressure to keep things moving. So I had to branch out and meet a whole lot of, develop some really quick friendships very quickly. As I've headed through 2022, as we come to 2023, we've dialed some of that back, and we've really moved into relationships where, it really makes the most sense. The routing is a good match. The cost is a good match. We can see the cost coming down, especially on the maritime shipping. I still am compelled to maintain relationships so that when my team, as some of it is business development, we've had some new customers in some new areas. We've branched out to new countries. So now I have to understand trucking in Turkey. We're doing a lot more business in Singapore and in Indonesia. Fine. But I also feel like it is this sort of that worst case scenario in the back of your mind where, like, what if I need someone who does this? So I have to sort of maintain this, like, instead of maintaining a core relationship, now I'm maintaining this sort of 20 or 30 vendor relationship just to have an idea of who's doing what when I might need that, which adds a bit of pressure and burden when you're already sort of trying to solve through these problems.
I would certainly echo the same thoughts. I certainly did not throw away any business cards. I still have multiple trucking companies that can step up if I'm having problems with rail, or if I'm having problems with crossing in Canada and I need to move something through the US, and all those connections, and the people that were able to do the associated paperwork for those kinds of transactions. And you made reference to air, and absolutely those relationships that were established, and how to do that if that's what I run into. It's a totally different level of preparedness now. Not only am I watching the weather forecast, I'm there going, okay, if the weather does this, then I'm going to implement X, Y, and Z plan. I don't want to go too deep down this one other path, but you referenced the essential retailer and the e-commerce piece. And the reality is e-commerce is a very expensive way to run your business. And there's all sorts of costs that businesses are still trying to dig themselves out of. Thankfully, buy online, pick up in stores has found a real resurgence, and that people are using the online to make selections, but then they are completing, let's call it the supply chain themselves. And when they, whether it's walk to the store, ride their bike, or take their car, or I guess bring their buddy's truck in Luke's case, when they come and help us out with that final mile, it is very financially beneficial to most retailers.
Jeff and Audrey, I agree with everything you guys said about like relationships, like on the external side. But I think what really changed a lot too is like the internal relationships. I think about conversations with procurement, with purchasing in 2020 and 2021. Really? That's how much things cost now? Are you sure? Or no, it doesn't take that long. And having this, like, seeing people's faces and them thinking, is this micro or macro? I know I read the news, but are you sure it's not you? And I think this conversation came up about supply chain just worked. All of a sudden now, maybe the leaders of supply chain are in different conversations. They're at the table, so to speak. But there's also these cross-functional conversations that I think didn't necessarily happen either, that are now happening. And is that something that's actually going to be a real, from a positive opportunity in the future, that, hey, all these inputs into the supply chain, there's more cohesion internally that's going to create, just naturally, like organically create this improvement. And I think about, some of the conversations I've had inside our business, and how that's really helped, and our relationship is more solidified now because, during this very unique time, there's more trust built because you had to be transparent about what's going on, and there's an education. I'll let you into my little unique world, but you let me into your unique world, but let's solution that problem together. So I think there were some real good outputs from the absolute chaos.
I agree with you, Luke, that we toss out collaboration as a sort of thing that everybody needs to be doing, but actually doing the doing on that is really hard work. And I think it's taken the restrictions of pandemic, cost of living crisis, to actually get departments who have been very rigid in how they think about their area rather than the peripheries, the adjacencies, to actually start to break those walls down and start to really work together and to understand each other's challenges and to come up with great new solutions. This is the groundwork to actually think about collaborating with our supply network. When we learn how to collaborate internally, we can start to recognize the characteristics. If we just go to the supply base or the supply network and go, right, guys, this is how it's going to work. We're collaborating, get this done, as we've done for many, many years, and given it the label of collaboration, it would just be no different to what it has been in the past. And when the thing hits the fan, we'll have all the same problems. We won't have those relationships. We won't have that understanding of what we're all trying to achieve as a team across company barriers and internally across department barriers. I think it's a really important point, because one of the things I think is a differentiating factor for organizations to really get a grip on is, how do we collaborate internally? And it doesn't mean how do we cooperate internally. We assume that we're going to cooperate. We're not going to, throw sticks at each other. Of course, cooperation happens just naturally. But how do we actually improve the value we're delivering to our consumers by actually breaking those walls down and finding new ways of working together, which give us great insights to make better decisions and give us better value at the front end of our business as we deal with our consumers.
Gary, if you don't mind, I'm going to actually use your original reference point and circle back on your loaf of bread and the miracle that it's there. You refer to it as a miracle that it's there, but let's talk about expectations. If you or I or any of us were to go to the grocery store tonight on the way home from work, we expect it to be there. Like it's It's like, what do you mean the bread's not here? Like, where's my bread? And that has forever been the approach that people have viewed supply chain with, is figure it out, make it happen, and I don't expect to see a disruption. And for the most part, those of us in the field have been able to deliver until we could deliver no longer. And don't get me wrong, he's a gentleman of a man, and I enjoy the coffees that I get to have with my CFO now. But it's interesting how interested he is in going out for coffee with me now to find out what's going on. And, you know, a 79% fuel surcharge in this past year is millions of dollars straight out of profitability. When I had the first conversation of, you know, that container that we moved that would normally be $2,000 is now $20,000, right? And we move, you know, hundreds, if not thousands of them. Well, a CFO really perks up when you get those kinds of numbers. And so there's an interesting internal dynamic that's changed in the world of supply chain, that, you know, rather than you're the guy that's got to make sure the trucks are scheduled to flow on time, there's a whole new, you know, what are you doing to the finances of the business that we need to take a look at. One of the other things that we're now seeing as well is when we don't control the manufacturing, we're seeing significant increases in cost coming out of those processes. And that is, if I could put my finger on what I think 2023 is going to bring about, that's the one, because a lot of it occurred through most of 2022. And while I'd like to think I'm a soothsayer now because of what I've been through in the last few years, I don't think I see everything. And this is the one that's now making its way onto my radar, is those early steps in supply chain that I have less control over are costing me more than the parts that I do control.
Jeff, I totally agree. A recent example that we have that's kind of like a really small microcosm of what you're saying is everything is in a box. Cardboard costs have gone up. The vendors are going, okay, well, I don't want to put it in a $25 carton. I want to put in a $15 carton because if my landed cost was $100, $10 on a box is a lot of money from a margin perspective. But then all of a sudden what we see is, you know, that nice little circular, you know, economy. All of a sudden my damage rates are up 8%. And I'm like, boy, I wish I bought that $10 box. Or, gee, I wish I figured a way to talk to the vendor about that $10 box, because now I've got all this damaged inventory that, you know what, is creating a new challenge that I have to deal with. As simple as the cost of a, you know, the dollar per square foot in a warehouse now is significantly more than it used to be. And all of a sudden, so that, again, that interconnectivity is so much stronger. But it's funny how you talk about, like, there's just these little components you don't control over, but they end up being like little pokes in your side later on in the outputs.
So true. And the piece about finance being very interested in our activities. You know, I feel like we had not quite carte blanche, but I mean, we had quite a bit of leeway to just make things happen, you know, sort of in the stress of the pandemic, right? Because you're facilitating the sales. We've got the sales, which is, you know, a fantastic place to be in, because we sort of had all thought, you know, maybe business would come to a halt and everybody would cancel everything. And so you sort of had this kind of like, yeah, just get it delivered, you know, $20,000 container. Okay. Like, we'll figure it out later. And it's like, well, now it's later. And now it's like, you spent what? What did you do last year? Well, we can't do that this year. And you're like, right. but like you both have said, Luke and Jeff, like the pricing has shifted. So now my container costs, they aren't $20,000 anymore, but my raw material costs, which I have no control over, you know, or is sort of a different department, those are skyrocketed. But that sort of financial pressure has come back, where we sort of didn't quite have to worry about it in the same way, but now we're very much popular. I do think having us in the room, though, where these decisions and strategy sessions are happening, and being able to get ahead of what the business is, because for a lot of us, we weren't necessarily part of the conversation because, of course, there was so much consistency. Of course, they're just going to get it done. They'll just make a phone call. They'll just work late. Like things will just happen. And I think now we've seen that it's like, yeah, maybe we should loop them in because, actually the value in a good supply chain manager, supply chain director is the experience, right? And what they can see if they have that ability to forecast, right? I can do my job a lot better when I know what kind of customers we're targeting, what sort of business volumes we're looking at. And something that I'm always inspired by Gary is like this designing the supply chain. I can't design it, I can only react to it. Whereas I think being able to have these agilities where, people talked about resiliency a lot in the face of inconsistency is to have some sort of insight on what we're trying to do and achieve.
Some really great points there, Audrey. Jeff mentioned this earlier where we thought having lots of stock around us was somehow building resiliency. Yeah, we can service a customer from this stock as long as we've got a pile of it, rather than thinking creatively, how do we make sure we can provide service and yet rely on the relationships and the routes to market and the capabilities that we have as an organization and our suppliers have to actually still create that situation that's more resilient, and especially when we do have further disruptions. As we look forward to 2023, and it's been a really great conversation because there's lots of depth of things that you three had to kind of work on to get through this. Audrey's point about the business before the pandemic operated here and the supply chain was down here somewhere, getting stuff done somehow. And then once a month you'd sit in front of the CFO and they'd say, you overspent, what you're doing, no more overtime, please. And it was a very sort of sterile, transactional kind of conversation for the most part. But I think that this time has been remarkable for elevating the supply chain so that we have this potential seat at the table to help the business to make wider, more informed decisions. But one of the things that the business has to do is it has to get off the price only marketing tactic. It has to find ways of differentiating itself, because the supply chain's purpose is to deliver consumer value. If it doesn't do that, it just falls apart and the business goes bust very quickly. But beyond that, it's to enable growth. And if we can work out how the business is trying to differentiate, that's where the supply chain can come in and help that along, so we don't get in the way of that great idea that somebody has that we're going to use all 4 elements or 6 elements. I'll lose track of how many P's there are, but the price, promotion, the place, and the product in a way that may sit with adjacencies but be discernible, or be on its own, like a Nike or a Walmart or a McDonald's or wherever it might be. It can stand without the need for adjacencies. The other point I'd make is we've kind of touched on it about the cost of people, to people who come into work, put on their S chart and get on with the job because they're motivated. I think one of the challenges for 23-24 is with the operatives who probably had to work away through the pandemic, had to turn up and be in the warehouse, be in the stores, drive the trucks, etc. We still need to kind of turn back on those and say, how can we make their roles more engaging in their jobs? It's one thing that they're good at their jobs, but we want them to really embrace their roles and their importance in delivering customer service. But for those people in the offices who were sent with a bland decision of like, send you home, you work from home, there's been some, I'd call it totalizing policies of you all come back or else. I think that those policies just need to be carefully managed as to why do people need to return to the office full-time, hybrid, or even stay at home and carry on. I think that there's a lot more juice to be squeezed from that lemon before we land on a really good spot, because there are people who, I think there was a survey done in the UK and they said that a third of the people who are currently working from home still, if they were forced to do any version of hybrid or even return to the office, would actually go and move to another job. So there's some real risks around, our staff and our operatives. And the third thing I'd offer about this year is about technology and about how we go about thinking about technology and where we apply it, how we apply it, and what hard work are we going to be prepared to do around the people component, the culture, the structures of how work is conducted, the processes, the activities, how they're going to be transformed, and where we introduce technology. I've hit us with quite a big chunk of talking points, but I'd be interested to get your views.
You said a lot there. So, Gary, so actually, I'm going to kind of jump on your last point. I think, it's really clear that all businesses now are technology businesses for the most part. And we just happen to do something that layers on top of that, right? Our fundamental now is like we're technology businesses. So I think now what I think is really interesting is that convergence of people with technology. So, and what I mean by that, I think a good microcosm of that would be is we're a good sized retailer, but we're not an international retailer. We operate nationally across the country. I think of these big international retailers that have the exact same problems that I did. I do X amount of dollars, they do hundreds of billions, and they have the exact same challenges that I did. They have actually maybe worse inventory positions, overflowing warehouses, can't unload stock. And where I see that convergence is, like, okay, great. They probably have best in class AI that help them with automation of fulfillment. This is how I should do allocation. This is what my planning should look like. And they had AI, and they still ended up at the same places as other businesses that had that person with an Excel sheet. And how are we going to re-look at that technology to go, hey, it should have made us better, but in this really unique time, it didn't. How do we make it better for us that, hey, listen, that technology actually does need a person to be able to help support that technology to have the right output, because the technology just going, okay, great, yeah, I should be 180 more of those. Well, maybe the system's looking at obviously analytics from behind, not necessarily looking forward. So that's something that, to use that as a microcosm, I think again that convergence of people with technology, I think is something that's going to be really interesting, moving forward, 23, 24, 25. Because the lead time and the capital expense for these big projects, I see this as like a multi-year conversation.
Gary, if I can build off of your commentary regarding people, employees, and opening the jacket and exposing their S on their chest, I believe we're in a situation now where when we look at supply chain and we look at the people of supply chain, and we look at what abilities are the most important, I believe reliability has now become the most important. And what I mean by that, not only a reliable supply chain, but you take the technology that Luke references there, and so many of us are adopting lots of different technologies to, forecast better and make sure we have the right kinds of products for our customer, et cetera. And we're making these investments. But at the end of the day, if my employee at the end of the line calls in sick or isn't reliable or doesn't show up for work or whatever it is, I don't have either that salesperson or that product to do what my business needs to do. And I think it's even more critical than it ever was in the past that we get people and have systems that show up. And after that, most of the rest of the stuff's going to take care of itself, because you've got a lot of people like ourselves on this call and those who are supporting us that are strong custodians of the process, but we need people to step up and fill the actual execution of our plans.
Certainly the technology has been key. And I think in going through it ourselves, some of these adoptions, right? We've realized now in the marketplace that we're not going to find a one size fits all. So we are all looking at, buying the piece that supports the other piece, and learning a lot more about things like API and connections than I think we had ever wanted to. But there's a piece too in a shifting, as Gary was mentioning, this hybrid concept, this, being the ability for some of us to work from home or to work remotely, which is in companies that have global teams, that's been very common. But I think there's a lack of training in us on the one side of us as employees having the skills to be able to do that. As much as we're like, yeah, I want to work from home. Okay, but do I actually have the skills to be able to manage my time differently now that I'm at home, and to manage the communication now that I'm not face to face? And then on the other side, as managers, do I have the skills to manage a remote workforce, or to manage people who aren't necessarily in the office, and still have, like, as you said, Jeff, still have that reliability where I know that there's performance, I know that things are happening. So I think it's like we do this sometimes, and the way we adopted email very quickly, but no one really thought about why we were adopting it, and is it the best tool for communication? In some cases it is, in some cases it isn't. But I think we're at that stage now where we have this environment where we're all kind of moving very quickly, but we're not kind of pausing to regroup ourselves and to reassess, okay, if we're looking to try and have agility and consistency and reliability, maybe the team as we've structured it doesn't work for that. Maybe the way we worked out our projects doesn't quite meet that need. So there's a gap in our professional development as well, or a skill set to be able to take us into these digital implementations, to understand why we're taking them on and how best to use them. And also that team collaboration of how can we have the most effective teams, because especially when you have someone good, you want to keep them on board. But do I have the skills to make sure their experience is a great one, and that they keep turning up on time and every day?
That's a pretty profound point to bring this conversation to a close. And it's been a really interesting one. We've gone over the tacticals over the last 2 or 3 years, and we started to look somewhat forward as to what are the key issues, and perhaps some of the ways that we can better manage into that future. Everything's changed, I say, but nothing's changed sometimes. It's a very interesting world where some of us have kind of we're back to normal now. Well, actually, nothing's normal now. It's very different to how it was even in 2019. But sometimes we find ourselves facing the same kind of flows of work, the same processes, sometimes the same technology and the structures around that. But it is a golden opportunity for us to really rethink this whole problem and say, what is that employee experience that we want to achieve? What levels of technology do we want to incorporate now and in the future, and have that roadmap out to this, let's call it ideal vision. But most importantly, to make sure that as we think about things, we think about a customer and where that customer is going, and how do we get in front of that customer with what we do now and in the future. So on that note, I'd like to thank Audrey, Jeff and Luke for a really interesting conversation, and ask our listeners and viewers to stay tuned for even more fascinating conversations from fascinating people. Thank you for listening today. I hope the information has been valuable for you and your organization. You can connect with me via my website, RetailAID.ca, go to the contact page, or via LinkedIn and connect with me there. Please feel free to follow the experts on this podcast for more insights and to join in the conversation. I look forward to collaborating with you and playing an active part with your supply chain and business's transformation as you are inspired to think big, be bold, scale, adapt, and win.